All right, this is World Solution Writing Process recording episode unlucky number 13. Hell yeah. We're gonna talk about revolutionary socialist coup d'etats while I share a non-soundproof wall with my reactionary Trump-supporting neighbors in my trailer park. Being a Trotskyist in a trailer park. Ooh, I love being alive. Ooh, yeah. All right, so arrest Congress. There's a powerful slogan. That's basically the idea here. Now, of course, we would hope that through various forms of parallel government, protest, civil disobedience, labor strikes, general unrest, you would be able to disintegrate the authority of a ruling government enough that it would just peacefully disintegrate. Governments do abdicate. Monarchies have abdicated. It happens. So, anyway, point being, it would be preferable if you never actually had to forcefully or even assertively disband a ruling government. But you know, life doesn't always go how you want, does it? No, it does not. So, Gene Sharp's major omission, this is from my notes, in the section Change of Government, which deals extensively actually with coup d'etats. Gene Sharp's major omission in his book From Dictatorship to Democracy is that while his strategy encourages organizers to focus on crowd protest and flipping the pillars, it's nonetheless the case that someone at some point has to occupy main government buildings, whether it's protesters, security forces who have defected to the revolution, or both. It seems the Gene Sharp model is to elevate crowd coup d'etats over military coup d'etats, understandably. This is probably the part that Gene Sharp was most uncomfortable with because it has the potential to involve violence compared to any other phase of the movement. He was a strict nonviolent pacifist. It's possible that sometimes changes of government do occur nonviolently. But there's also the possibility that a government will refuse to abdicate, resign, or disperse and will have to be dragged out of the building. For example, the insurrection of 10 August 1792, when the people stormed the royal palace in the French Revolution, was kind of unavoidable. Anyway, back to the notes. You don't necessarily have to arrest the old government, but you do have to disperse it if it fails to disperse itself. Someone has to tell Congress that they are an illegal gathering after all. The scenario of bouncing on the heads of society, or bouncing on top of society, has far too much potential to result in the regime remaining. Gene Sharp remains the world's master theorist of political strategy. This book owes its existence to him. At the same time, he kind of ruined the world by ending the Soviet Union, but it's not like there weren't problems with the Soviet Union. If you have ever seen the Lawrence of Arabia movie, there was a moment where they seized the town hall, as well as the post office, power plant, telephone exchange, hospitals, and fire department. During a change of government, you do have to take that sort of critical infrastructure, or at least it helps. It increases your power as you carry out a change of government. So, what do you do with personnel? You can lock them in the broom closet temporarily. At some point, you're going to have to take and barricade key areas. So, once you disperse the old government, it's a good time to proclaim the new government, even if you had done so already. This would be the moment to proclaim your parallel government as not only the rightful and legitimate government, but the sovereign government now holding power, and that you expect the cooperation of all state agencies, security forces, and the general public. This sort of declaration could be made from the floor of your country's legislature, from some kind of media broadcast, any national symbolic place, or really from anywhere, as long as you demonstrate that you are now in control of the situation. So coups use troops, whereas putsches can use any type of power grab, whether the participants are a mob or professionals. Thus, a coup is actually a subtype of putsch, which utilizes professional security forces, typically professional military units. Now, I've read the book Coup d'etat Practical Handbook by Edward Lutwak. Much of this comes from him. The four main ways of entering a building to carry out such an arrest or dispersion of a legislature or other governmental body is frontal entry, which is the most difficult, diversion, which is you use a diversionary protest or attack to draw security forces away, infiltration, you sneak in some side or back way, and number 4, being let in by an insider. Now, if you notice, on January 6th, the frontal assault was the diversion for a time, and the infiltrators used a side window. The frontal tunnel, was never actually penetrated. The police held the line for the entire 3 hours. The frontal tunnel I refer to as the Lady Gaga tunnel, because in front of that is where Lady Gaga stood during the National Equality March in 2010. So the Lady Gaga tunnel held, just saying. Anyway, also don't tell anyone who works for the government to do number 4, unless you're literally in the moment of regime change, because that is a serious criminal act to try to subvert people into letting you into a government building to enter it. Yeah, no. Just be aware that, as I said in previous episodes, talking at the level of theory is legal. Doing these things is illegal. Just keep that in mind. This is a history lesson in many ways. The scenario of the sovereign bouncing on the heads of society is certainly humorous to visualize. Everyone loves the image of a frustrated tyrant being disregarded repeatedly and disobeyed or ignored by their subordinates. The problem is that if a single pillar collapses back into obedience to the old system, it can start a cascading snowball domino effect that reimposes the old system. Thus, regime leadership must be at least temporarily detained during the moment of power transition, or rendered unable to communicate by digital control or by control of communications, such as digital control or signal jamming. You need a strong unit cohesion to carry out arrests of leadership personnel instead of just having a riot and wrecking the place. So you will need to prepare and drill organized fighting units instead of just a big mob, even if those organized fighting units are using nothing but their hands and handcuffs to carry out the arrests. As January 6 demonstrates, a small handful of organized fighting units within the less organized crowd were able to shift the direction of the entire event, and they never even used their guns. Again, this is a moment to mention Nikos Poulantzas, who believed that socialist transition will happen through a conflict within the state. However, the only way it seems to incite a conflict within the state is to exert pressure from outside the state. Important thing to remember. Technically, the October Revolution was a putsch rather than a coup because many of the Red Guards were not regular military forces but armed workers. In reality, it could be called a hybrid between a revolution and a coup d'etat. In the modern information landscape, seizing the major news networks may be equally important as seizing government buildings, but then January 6 proved that coup attempts in developed countries are not secretive military affairs, but televised events announced beforehand on social media. If you were trying to overthrow the US government, for example, instead of immediately trying to seize the Capitol building like January 6, you could create an opposition government in a different building, maybe even a different city. It would be in keeping with tradition to start a revolutionary government in Philadelphia. Then, with an alternative center of power established, you can begin low-intensity action against the opposing government, such as protests, and escalate as you wish. It's imaginable that a crowd coup like January 6 could be replicated without anyone bringing any firearms, and more successfully with a little coordination. You don't need guns to arrest unarmed people. Personnel can be arrested with wrestling holds and handcuffs or zip ties, not handguns, let alone assault rifles. The January 6 rioters also didn't need to bring explosives, even though they did. Oh God. A completely bad and totally unnecessary idea. Instead of executing captives during a coup, you can just lock them in the broom closet until the transition is over. Make sure to actually occupy the rooms with the government personnel, like the House and Senate within the Capitol building, for example. Not like those clowns on January 6 who merely filled the symbolic rotunda. The biggest mistake of the January 6 perpetrators was not to immediately announce a revolutionary government from the chamber of the Senate once they occupied it. Apparently Trump's revolution was contingent on the Secret Service giving him permission to wage it, some revolution. Every coup requires an arrest of your opponent's leadership. In many ways, that's what a coup literally is. By arresting the opposing leadership, you gain temporary control over the power dynamic. Point is, there will be many powerful people trying to help your captives escape. One solution is immediate execution, but it can look bad on TV and politically. The practical answer is simply to keep them under extremely heavy guard, make sure the guards are loyal through either ideology, money, or surveillance. Move the captives around often and keep the movements and locations a secret. You have to do this with deposed kings, deposed dictators, and deposed presidents after all. So, Gene Sharp's minor oversight, the miniature coup inside every revolution. While a coup or a mob putsch may be slightly violent, it's far less violent than terrorism or guerrilla warfare, and less violent still than the civil war or return of the old regime, which could occur without decisive action. The most dangerous weapon of January 6 wasn't guns or bombs, it was the sticks they used to break the windows, the shoving with their bodies, but above all, extreme psychological determination. However, during a regime change, civilians may work with professional soldiers who join the revolution and carry out the regime change for us. Such an operation would require the presence and political leadership of activists and revolutionaries to ensure the regular troops don't waver in their convictions. A good liaison between the movement and security forces would be a paramilitary activist, combining political reliability with basic combat familiarity. This means someone who is not professional military, but is a consistent revolutionary who has given themselves a very rudimentary basic military or police training. So both to work as credible liaisons with professional security forces, and possibly to carry off a mob putsch ourselves without them, it still makes sense for regime change operators to learn basic firearm safety and familiarity, as well as small unit tactics, including basics like fire and movement, as well as breach and clear. This means people also need basics like clock position, if you know what that is, imagining the space around you as and the directions of it as the numbers on a clock. So dead ahead of you is 12 o'clock, behind you is 6 o'clock, etc. Sector assignment and just a few commands. Basic proficiency is enough, not elite level. Even the basics will come off like a SWAT team to most people, especially a bunch of scared politicians whose door you just kicked. For this reason, regime change operators should live the lifestyle neither of a guerrilla soldier or a pure civilian, but a paramilitary lifestyle of maintaining typical civilian roles while training for combat with bare hands, sticks, and firearms, as well as secure communications, more useful for civil disobedience than anything nefarious. While Gene Sharp's crowd-based regime change is the missing piece of Nikos Poulantzas' theories of a socialist revolt within the state, Edward Litwack's Coup handbook is the missing piece of Gene Sharp's theories. The missing piece of the Coup handbook is training for combat and carrying out arrests. So how to disband a legislature? It requires politico-military dominance. You need large crowds, enough troops on your side, or at least standing out of the way. It can use police and or military, though typically it does not use police. Oddly enough, in the coup d'etat practical handbook, Edward Litwack notes that in most revolutions, it's either crowds or the military. The police usually do not participate in the revolution. At most, they stand aside. Do not attempt this. Do not attempt to disband an opposing legislature if the political situation is not prepared. We do not need premature adventurism. So you obtain a list of members' residences of the legislature you're disbanding, possibly by just asking for them, or you arrange temporary holding facilities. You arrange guard shifts and coordination. I covered this in the previous section on arresting rulers, change of government. That was change of government part 1, so I'm going to skip past some of this. No need to be repetitive. You may need to transport apprehended members, so bring some vans, whatever. Just as the New Testament follows after the Old, so must forgiveness occur after judgment. If the message of Christ was that we are all God, then we must not wait for justice but create it. Don't pity the ruling class. They brought it on themselves. Pity yourself for the things they've put you through and the things they are forcing us to do to bring them down. At times, we must use reactionary methods against reactionaries. Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy is the true manual of modern and Western coups d'etats. The modern Western coup is the crowd coup, not the military coup. This is not meant so much to criticize Dr. Sharp's work as to allay skeptical anti-capitalists who think Gene Sharp was ignoring the realities of violent force. Far from it. Essentially, the Sharp method is for the protest movement to keep its hands clean, inciting an abdication or coup inside the state through mass protest, but not participating directly in the power struggle within the state forces, not demanding a coup per se, just demanding removal, and not really specifying who should do the removal, just increasing pressure for removal. Naturally, the people who receive this pressure will be the state pillars, who can then carry out a coup. The only reason we go into the technicalities here is in case something goes wrong. The pillars don't do their job, and the old regime is teetering but not abdicating. Leaving them in place could create a dangerous instability in which the revolutionary government might be shut down by the pillars, who still obey the old government, forcing the revolutionary government to use its own volunteer forces to shut down the old government. The difference between January 6th and the Bolshevik insurrection, besides their total political opposition to each other, is that during January 6th, the revolutionary government was literally just Trump himself, and no economic redistribution was promised, whereas the Bolsheviks installed workers' councils, their own party organization, and initially a coalition of other socialist parties, and the entire point was redistribution. To be clear, part of January 6th's weakness was simply the unpopularity of its politics, as proven by the electoral defeat to which it was a response. Part of its weakness is that Trump himself doesn't form a very inspiring revolutionary government, Who wants to die for that guy who is not really doing much for them? Maybe instead of claiming electoral fraud, he should have just proclaimed a new government on the basis of a necessary national rebirth, but of course in real life, it's a massive relief he did not do this. January 6th was a coup not only against the liberals, but also against the moderate conservatives within Trump's own government. The self-coup, that's a category to look up, self-coup. It's when the person who's already the executive of state carries out a coup against other parts of the government. The self-coup was not only against Congress, but against the forces within Trump's own administration who obstructed Trump by defending the rule of law, for example, Mike Pence, as well as military and police figures who were opposed to January 6th. It may sound tempting to wipe out the liberals and conservatives in one fell swoop, but not if we're replacing them with fascists. The cure is literally worse than the disease. Coups rely on a degree of secrecy, on conspiracy, the less than you would think. The October insurrection of the Russian Revolution was planned in semi-secrecy, semi-publicly. Every ship has leaks, but you can try to reduce them. I'm just going to go till I hit halfway through this section. Trump may be America's Kornilov, a far-right general in Russia who attempted a coup around the Russian Revolution. And it may be the act of stopping a coup, which ironically brings us to power, as when the Bolsheviks shut down the Kornilov coup, and by doing so positioned themselves perfectly for their own rise. Any protest action to occupy a capital city should revolve less around taking over the building of the old legislature and more around non-violently blockading its entrances to disorganize the old regime. The new government might be better off functioning in a different building entirely to avoid the chaos and legal risks of any protests at the old seat of government. It might make more sense to non-violently block the entrances of a Capitol building rather than enter the building itself so it stays in the people's possession, rather than bothering to breach the inner chambers of deliberation, which will probably evacuate its members once protesters surround the building. If they don't evacuate, protesters can begin chants demanding the self-disbandment of the ruling government. In a certain sense, the entire Gene Sharp strategy is inducing a coup rather than performing one. If we generate enough mass protest pressure and support that the state pillars carry out a regime change on our behalf, then the activists never carried out a coup, but they created the conditions which made a coup possible and necessary. Such a scenario could also cause the old government to simply resign, abdicate, or disband itself. Finally, if neither the pillars carry out a regime change nor the old government self-disbands, then the crowd at this point may have enough strength to occupy whatever buildings need to be occupied for the regime change to be complete. There is a very interesting manual that I need to bring up, Curzio Malaparte, on revolutionary coups. You can find this if you look it up. There is an Italian communist named Curzio Malaparte who wrote about revolutionary coup d'etats, wrote a very interesting book, which you can find free on the internet, that talks a lot about the October Revolution, but also others, and the concrete planning of the October Revolution. So, in October 1917, Trotsky planned the details of the insurrection with only partial secrecy, as leader of the Military Revolutionary Committee. Opponents of the plan leaked it to the press, and it still succeeded. That's because things like this are only feasible once the social conditions have gotten to the point where the old government is practically falling apart already, often due to facing continued protest. It is strange that the October insurrection was planned so publicly, but it's easy to imagine that keeping the secret as closely as modern military coups are kept was simply impractical during the socially chaotic situation of the competing governments scheming each other's demise, not with tight military units, but crowds which probably didn't practice good secrecy. However, the Bolshevik planners also had the social protection of a defensive dynamic, in which any attempt by the standing government to arrest the revolution planners is implicitly defended by the public crowd backlash against the ruling government this action would create. It is a social rather than military defense, though these categories sometimes spill into each other. Modern coups d'etats in developed countries don't require the tight control over communications required by old military coups. January 6th was fully televised, and it will be televised if there is some kind of crowd push or troop maneuver which secures our parallel government firmly into power as the new ruling government. In a certain sense, Trump's mistake was to trust the system. He really thought the Secret Service would physically let him go to the Capitol building. He probably hoped police and military would play a more active, even supportive role given the chess match leading up to January 6th by local Democratic authorities like the mayor to keep the military away from the situation and fear the military could potentially side with Trump. Clearly, some kind of internal coup is not an option in a state structure as stable as the USA's. To shake our state structure into transformation will require the external pressure of the masses, building and asserting a revolutionary government over time, by combining an opposition government with mass protest and civil disobedience. It can't be achieved by some quick and easy internal maneuver inside the state, except those may be done on our behalf by sympathizing authorities once we build an opposition government and a large movement around it. HIMARS, the high-precision artillery vehicles, are made in Michigan and Arkansas, but that should only matter if this breaks down into civil war, definitely not as the way of taking power. We just better make sure the Midwest stays on the correct side of the conflict. It probably will. You may need to take control of things like a national texting service. During the October insurrection of the Russian Revolution, apparently the main fighting was really over controlled bridges, and secondarily over the central government building. As we have seen in January 6 and the 1964 Brazilian coup, there is often support for regime change inside the very legislature that is getting overthrown, with specific members of the legislature taking the floor to speak in favor of the power grab while it is underway. While our regime change is more of a revolution than a coup, it sure would help to have just one or two congresspersons legitimizing the transition. It's hard to imagine AOC or Bernie Sanders doing such a thing. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a single person who would? For power to properly change hands in a country, protesters might have to occupy a building, or security forces might carry out a coup to hand power to the people in response to the political crisis of mass civil disobedience. It's better not to start the struggle for state power by immediately occupying town hall, but instead forming a revolutionary government in some other setting and building up its support over time before attempting something like a government occupation. One big difference here is that, unlike January 6, the goal is not to harm the legislators, but simply to occupy the building with protesters to socially signify that the old government no longer holds authority and that the transition of power from the old government to the new government has been finalized. Some revolutions may cause the old system to resign, others may involve a protester occupation of government buildings, and other revolutions may involve a limited violent battle over government buildings, as well as the arrest of the legislators of the old government. The preference should always be resignation, followed by protester occupation, with violent battle being the last resort. As an anonymous punk once said to me, it's not hard to take over a city. You either live in a city or near one, or you move to an edge city, the borderlands between the urban and suburban. You start a parallel government at the local level, competing not with the national government but the city council, a revolutionary city council like during the French Revolution or Paris Commune. Commune being the French term for a city council rather than a hippie commune. Grow the movement through recruiting and street actions, recruit among the population generally and workers specifically. Conspiracy theorists locate the helm of the American system in the CIA. Marxists tend to place it in Wall Street. But if the executive of the ruling state is a committee for the affairs of the ruling class, as Marx said, and intelligence black ops function as a sort of super executive, then the political executive is more like a mediator between popular pressure and the true authority of the intelligence community. The intelligence community might as well be an alien species as far as the general public is concerned. Their agenda is equally unknown to us as the little green men. They might include decent people who would sympathize with the sort of revolution we're trying to build, but they might also torture us with electricity for being socialists like they did to the South Americans for decades during Operation Condor. Who knows? The issue with crowd-based regime change is that it may inevitably involve occupying a government building, and now people are afraid to do that because they don't want to be associated with January 6. The good news is that around the world, protesters occupy legislatures and presidential palaces all the time in rebellions which typically aren't fascist. However, this is also why it's best for most of our organizing to focus on forming a revolutionary government and demanding redistribution and regime change, and not on any plans to occupy any government buildings, which is something we can either avoid doing entirely depending, or it can wait until it's necessary to manage. Okay, so Burkina Faso had a coup d'etat in January 2022. How about that? In the announcement, a pronunciamiento, the way they announced it, they said, the movement which brings together all the components of the defense and security forces has thus decided to put an end to the power of Mr. Roch Marc Christian Kabore on 24 January 2022. The main thing about a crowd rebellion is you have to show up and show presence. That part of it is mostly psychological. Apparently, somewhere Trotsky said, even barricades, apparently a mechanical element of the uprising, are of significance in reality above all as a moral force. In Battlestar Galactica, a quote says, the president offered complete unconditional surrender. The Cylons didn't even respond. Sometimes you make announcements like the Chinese did at the founding ceremony of the nation. But of course they had to gradually paint over the people standing near Mao in the painting of the event because he purged them all. There may need to be forceful leadership changes in any remaining uncooperative pillars. Make no mistake, some of the ruling class will hold on to power with their last drop of life, refusing to let go and until we turn their lives into horror movies, even if it's the abstract existential horror of facing mass disobedience to their commands and not literal carnage. The central component of a coup is always the justification for it, as this is what allows resources and personnel to be accumulated for the cause. A socialist takeover of Congress is possible only by physical occupation or change of government and not by elections. At some point, you have to begin doing insurrectionary organizing in which you discuss direct plans for changing regimes. Part of this is rhetorical agitation. You have to start telling people that we are pathetic for allowing the ruling class to govern us for so long, and if we had any dignity, we would have risen up centuries ago, but better late than never. With all of this maneuvering, a coup can be compared to elaborate stage magic, the essential ingredients being choreography, coordination, and diversion, or distraction. A popular revolution in the name of a parallel government, formed in the name of the people's rightful grievances and totally independent of the elections, is completely different from and far more legitimate than the power grab of January 6, in which someone working within the ruling government's electoral system decided to overthrow it in the name of false claims of electoral fraud. A revolution claiming that all elections under capitalism are slanted toward the ruling class is completely different from a reactionary false claim that votes are being rigged, and a crowd occupation on this first basis is far more legitimate than the crowd occupation of January 6 on that second basis. Sometimes something is okay when the good guys do it, and not when the bad guys do it, and regime change is the biggest example. Sometimes it's okay when we do it is actually a good and fair rule. An extra-legal transfer of power in the name of meeting people's material needs is not ethically equal to an extra-legal transfer of power in the name of dragging the country backwards. The personal risks involved in regime change are also the lesser evil compared to enduring the continuation of capitalism. So a coup is when someone already possessing state resources carries out a change of government. A revolution is when people who do not possess state resources carry out a change of government. The issue is that things get blurry because during the process of revolution, if you flip the pillars, the rebelling masses go from not possessing state resources to suddenly possessing them. This is why the October Revolution is such an edge case. It combined a crowd uprising by armed workers with a military uprising of whole units of government soldiers in a state of mutiny. Though there was little fighting, it was still a forceful takeover of a building involving a minor conflict between two different sides which both had guns. However, unlike January 6, the October Revolution focused more on organizing its own forces than sabotaging the defenses of central government buildings from within. Finally, the October Revolution had the backing of an alternative government, whereas January 6 pretended to be a legitimate action within the framework of the current state, of which the Bolsheviks made absolutely no such pretense. They were simply ending one government and installing another which had already been formed. Almost done. The only real way to take over the internet is either 1. A general workers' rebellion of workplace occupations, spreading to the workers at internet service providers, or 2, a victorious revolution sending sympathetic troops to occupy and nationalize the internet service providers. Infrastructural seizure will not work so differently as in the past, especially in communications. Instead of seizing the telephone exchanges and telegraph lines, we will take over the cellular service providers with their digitized telephone exchanges, and the internet service providers with their control of the internet backbone. All of this will hopefully be done by the workers at these institutions, but we should make special arrangements for supporters of the parallel government to do this in a revolutionary situation, in case the spontaneous spread of workplace collectivization is unevenly distributed, which tends to happen during waves of workplace occupations, and has not reached the communication services. The battle is not entirely, as the world's leading Marxist theorist comedian Slavoj Žižek theorized, initially a cybersecurity conflict between computers, but more over political control of the grid. Interregional and local internet and cellular providers, especially in strategic cities, are more important than international cell and internet connections between countries. After either the workers or officers of the parallel government are in control of the cellular and internet services, a supercomputer-driven battle for the grid by methods of cyber warfare may ensue. But it's important to remember that the human staff near these central cores are influenced by political events and may be unenthusiastic about digitally crushing a revolution their own friends and family may be part of. It's possible a faction of reactionaries or of the ruling class may try to digitally sabotage the entire grid and economy rather than surrender it to the people, a quote-unquote fire sale cyber attack, as depicted in Die Hard 4, but the working class includes specialists in all areas of infrastructure, so the people are capable of repairing and rebuilding quickly. We can do this. So it was really Zizek that clued me into the fact that it was Trotsky who carried out the highly technical aspects. There are technical aspects of urban takeover being surgical, small scale, and centrally important, while the mass politics of parallel governments and large demonstrations are simultaneously centrally important. Probably more important, but the two are comparable in levels of importance. Okay. In the next episode, I'll get into all the ways that Trotsky organized the takeover of infrastructure in Petrograd. Anyway, closing out, when the Gene-Sharp model works as intended, the protest movement need not involve itself in any direct power seizure, because the political pressure of mass protest and nonviolent disruption incites the pillars of state to carry out a coup of their own initiative. When such initiative within the pillars is lacking, it's about using protesters, workers, and soldiers in mutiny to take control of specific key strategic locations within central major cities. The Bolsheviks essentially formed a small army of roughly 40,000 people out of workers and soldiers in mutiny and simply took the city. Okay, I am halfway through my notes on change of government. That's long enough. This has been episode 13 of World Solution Writing Process Podcast, signing off.